somebody else's talk. That would be interesting. Thank you everyone for sticking around and braving the horrendous weather. I'm mostly just hoping I don't die at this point. So again, my name's Cara Ewell Hodkin. I'm a PhD student at SUNY ESF in Syracuse with Karin Limburg, who I don't see in the room, which is kind of nice, thank you. I'm going to ask you a question later, and that question is going to be, please recall my title. And it is, well, that didn't work. And for real, it's the ongoing quest to track anadromous blueback herring using otolith isotopes. So, this is finicky, isn't it? So, our aim with my whole project is to eventually determine the demographic characteristics and life history of the Mohawk River spawning population of blueback herring. And basically by analyzing anything I can get my hands on, scales, otoliths, muscle tissue, stomach contents, whatever. And if you look at the map, and this is probably something that's super familiar to everyone, but the native range for blueback herring is here in this tan, and so they're pretty widely distributed along the Atlantic coast. And if you zoom in to the red box in New York, you're probably even more familiar with the beautiful DEC graphic that indicates where blueback herring have been found in New York State. And the nice thing for my purposes is that this really illustrates the tight connection between the Mohawk River as the largest tributary of the Hudson, going north and south, and those connections that those fish are making between the Mohawk, the Hudson, and the Atlantic Ocean. So, I'll explain the random, really old pop culture reference here in a second. But there are multiple previous studies that have been done on the Mohawk River blueback herring population that really suggest that textbook anadromy really isn't a thing, unless you're looking at the textbook. In real life, you know, just like rodents of unusual size, I don't think they exist. Textbook anadromy, it's not a thing. So, we have to take that into account when we're looking at such a complex system like the Hudson River watershed, including the Mohawk River, that for something that complex, we're not going to find a simple solution for this population. And like I said, textbook is the only place you're going to find true textbook anadromy. And that being, you know, your adults come to the spawning habitats, the young are in the nursery for a while, and then eventually they're going to go out to the ocean in their adult habitat, grow to maturity, and then come on back and make that classic migration triangle. But I like to tell everybody that I can get to sit still long enough to talk to, that the fish don't read these books. You know, we read these books, but, you know, last I checked, the fish aren't following the rules. So, this is my favorite slide because I worked really hard on it. And what I want to reiterate is that, you know, the aim of this part of the project anyway is to expand upon our knowledge of the blueback herring complex life history through the use of stable isotope analysis, microchemistry, and using that as valuable natural tags. So Karin likes to describe it as opening the big blue box that is the ocean. And hence we have our objective to discover the seaward end, the details of that seaward end of the blueback Karin migration. So what we do know is that there is a fairly decent relationship between the strontium isotope ratios, salinity, and water temperature. Some studies, and I've scattered a bunch of them around, have found reliable, reasonable, and useful, probably the best, estimates of water temperature from fish otoliths. So why can't we? Well, we gave it a go. For those of you who are potentially less familiar with otoliths than some others in the room, otoliths are 3 pairs of bony structures located in the skull of teleost fishes, and you can see it maybe a bit better in this zoom in right here. And the ones that we tend to extract for fisheries use are the largest pair of the sagittal otoliths. And otolith stable isotope ratios are a function of the water chemistry, and the isotopic fractionation, as it is, occurs during the transport of dissolved minerals, dissolved substances from the water into the otolith. And every day, those substances are accreted on the active surface of the otolith. So the first thing we did was perform life history transects, and you can see that outlined here in red on one of my fabulously terrible blueback Karin otoliths. And we did these life history transects of the strontium isotopes on otoliths that we collected from adult spawning blueback Karin via a multi-collector that you can see up here in this top picture where I was once happy. And multi-collector, laser ablation, inductively coupled mass spectrometry, much like fish passage. Let's say that 10 times fast. So ultimately we ended up with this nonsense. And so really it's a simple 3-step process. The first step, we calculate the strontium isotope ratio for the last year of the life of each fish. And presumably that last year of life was spent at sea. So what I did was I just calculated the average of the strontium isotopes at the outermost 150 microns of that life history transect. And that gives you that row, 1 cell for each fish. The second step, we then take that to calculate an estimate of salinity that each of those fish was exposed to. And this column really just uses a function in Excel that it looks at column L, way over here, of strontium isotope ratios, and that correspond, it returns a value of salinity from the next column over. And we got those values from just a standard mixing curve that Karin was gracious enough to construct using the average Hudson value for strontium isotope ratio on one end member and the value for the contemporary seawater on the other. So at this point, we've got our estimate of the salinity that the fish are exposed to. So our simple third step is to then finally calculate the corresponding oxygen isotope ratio of the seawater that the fish was exposed to. And that's going to be this column in blue. We got there from mathematics that we found from Fairbanks' work published in 1982. And what they did was went all down the Atlantic coast of the United States and took oxygen isotope ratios of water samples. And if you look really carefully, you can just tease out, even with my horrible vision, the very end of this line of H's and that H is 9.14. And that is the value of the Hudson River's freshwater oxygen isotope ratio. And that was collected in Kingston. So then they did a regression, and we used that regression formula with that 9.14, and then to do a little correction to the Vienna PD belemnite to make it comparable to carbonate. Again, subtract another small fraction. So the second step, after the 3 simple steps to get there, the second phase, then we went through and micromilled off the outer edge of all of those same otoliths. And you can see in my really bad art, it's the exact same otolith, but if you look really, really close, trust me, you can see the track of the laser. But then we ground off, we drilled off all the outer edge. And again, that's presumably the last year of life, probably, maybe, spent at sea. So we're at this step, we sent that tiny fraction of dust out to be analyzed for oxygen isotope ratios, and we finally end up with this column right here. Those are the oxygen isotope ratios for the otoliths themselves. And from there, finally, we can calculate the temperature that the fish were exposed to in the water just by using one of the equations that we found in Jones and Campana in 2009. And it's pretty simple arithmetic, just our water isotope, our otolith isotope, divide, add, bang, you got a number. Those were our numbers. Okay. Now, here's the point of my talk where I'm going to ask you that question that I warned you about at the very beginning. Do you recall my title? What we got in that last column was a range of temperature values of seawater blueback herring potentially were exposed to in their last year of life in the North Atlantic that ranged from roughly negative 27 degrees Celsius to almost 60 degrees Celsius. The picture of the woman on the title page is not actually me banging my head on the desk. So, well, it didn't really work. So what we got out of this whole exercise was that clearly those temperatures, that enormous range that is obviously not a biologically useful range of temperature for fish, is not an accurate representation of the North Atlantic, at least not of current day fish. But it wasn't necessarily a useless exercise. That process is useful for other species, other fish species that are probably found within a narrower range of salinity. Blueback herring, fully anadromous, go from 0 to 34 salinity. It's the entire range. It didn't really work. It's likely that if we went and found a new set of values for the oxygen isotope ratios for the Mid-Atlantic bight, we might get better results. The values that we used from are almost 40 years old. And it's entirely likely that it's shifted enough when you're working with such small fractions that small shift in the oxygen isotope ratios is enough to make completely ridiculous temperature numbers. At the end, I do feel like we got a little bit of insight into the incredibly convoluted world of blueback herring migration, but maybe not quite what we'd hoped. And with that, would like to thank basically everyone in the Western Hemisphere. Many people at ESF. Huge, huge gratitude to Karin, who snuck in when I wasn't looking. Clearly I wouldn't be here without her. The great majority of my funding from the Hudson River Foundation. All of my multi-collector isotope analysis was done at UC Davis, and another good portion from DEC, and as well as doing a lot of collecting with Scott Wells. Thank you, Scott. That was great. He also takes care of my boat. And all the micromilling was done at Syracuse University. And with that, I thank you very much, and please don't ask me questions.
Although we do have time for some questions.
Okay, I didn't. Don't ask me hard questions. You guys are good. You follow directions very well. I'm impressed.
Do you normally shut it off?